Good afternoon. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eric Lawston. I'm a principal at Husch Blackwell Strategies with over 20 years' experience as a congressional and government affairs professional. Husch Blackwell Strategies is a government consulting and policy firm affiliated with the Husch Blackwell Law Firm. We're excited to have you join our program today for an energy legislative update. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit the question box. We will try to answer all questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. A PDF of the presentation is available in the resources folder. This program has been approved for legal education credit. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. Certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Toward the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We will use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. That is all for the housekeeping items. Let's get started with our program. I'll be going over an overview of federal clean energy legislation and providing some context for where we're at and why things are moving a little less quickly than we had hoped them to do. However, before we get started on that, we have one short poll question that I think will inform our discussion moving forward. And I'll also note that these poll questions are important for you all to respond to as part of the continuing education credit. We'll pause here on this first poll question for a moment for you to read through the options and submit an answer. Give you all one more moment there. Great, thank you. So the question was, would climate change be best addressed by government policies that A, offer incentives for clean energy, B, impose regulatory mandates to reduce emissions, or C, funding for innovation on new and clean energy technologies? Thankfully, these are not binary questions, and ultimately we hope to have some mix of the three in policies moving forward. But as you'll see, it's been a challenging process for all of them to progress. I think it's important first to give you all a background and recent history of the pathway forward of legislation and politics over this calendar year 2020. Then we'll talk about the American Jobs Plan and infrastructure legislation and how that has affected the clean energy debate moving forward. And now, finally, touching on the Build Back Better agenda and the clean energy policies and funding that the President and the Democratic Congress hope to move forward. As you all are aware, President Biden came into office in 2021 with big ambitions and big goals in terms of pushing clean energy policy forward. First matter of the year was the American Recovery Plan, a $1.9 trillion package pushed through to address COVID recovery and the economic relief following the pandemic. Then the President, in the April timeframe, released the American Jobs Plan, which focused on infrastructure and energy, and then also the American Family Plan, which focused on human needs, including healthcare, education, nutrition, and a number of other policy goals. The President also came to office with a goal of reducing greenhouse gas pollution from 2005 levels by about 50% by 2030. However, at the same time, we are facing an incredibly closely divided Congress where the House Democrats have a 3-seat margin and the Senate is split 50-50 with the Vice President passing occasional tie-breaking votes. President Biden also came to office with a limited appetite for big regulations, nothing on the particular order of the Clean Power Plan addressed by President Biden, although they are underway trying to roll back some of the changes that President Trump had made to some of the policies put in place under Obama. Because of the closely divided Congress, it means that legislation must either be very bipartisan or use a partisan budget process to pass items, commonly known as reconciliation. Reconciliation establishes significant limitations on passing bills that are focused on policy, and they must be closely tied to fiscal matters. And at the same time, despite small Democratic majorities, there are a number of competing priorities between all of the individual members, specifically the progressives and moderates. As I noted earlier, in March, the Congress passed the $1.9 trillion COVID relief and economic recovery package. This was approved on a party line vote, again using the reconciliation process. Moving forward, in June, the House of Representatives passed an ambitious, and forgive me for the typo there, $715 billion infrastructure investment package called the Invest in America Act. This was a very ambitious transportation-focused infrastructure package with funding for transportation, transit, rail, broadband, and a number of other priorities. Although there were some green infrastructure measures included, including resources for electronic vehicles, charging infrastructure, transit funding increases for electric buses, and highway policies that were intended to deter significant new capacity and to reduce carbon emissions. At the same time, there was little to no clean energy funding included this, which is a significant divergence from the policy that the House of Representative Democrats pursued in 2020, when they moved a very similar infrastructure package, but it also included some very significant energy and clean energy policy issues as well, including investments in the grid, new energy efficiency standards both for buildings and appliances, also additional resources for electric vehicles, measures to increase the development of clean energy on public lands, tax incentives and extensions, funding for hydro, among many others. The House passed this bill with only 2 Republican ayes on, again, a very partisan policy approach. At the same time, the Senate began a consideration of a separate approach on infrastructure. 2 of the leading infrastructure committees, the Environment and Public Works Committee and the Commerce, Science, and Transportation, moved bipartisan measures to address infrastructure funding, and then overlaid on that were bipartisan negotiations between Senator Sinema from Arizona and Senator Rob Portman from Ohio, who brought together ultimately a gang of about 20 different bipartisan members of the Senate who collectively negotiated and came up with what was called the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. This proposal was a $1.1 trillion bill with $550 billion in new funding. That means that the other $550 billion was sort of baseline funding. If you just extended current law, that would continue on. So $550 billion new funding, most of which was focused on transportation infrastructure, but it also included a sizable energy title. This energy title I'll get to in a moment, but most of the funding focused on highway, transit, rail, as well as ports and waterways, broadband, resilience, and some other water infrastructure. Despite the successful votes on a bipartisan basis in the Senate, 69-30, passing in August, this bill remains pending in the House, not having yet taken a vote on it. In that infrastructure package, there was $12 billion approved for grants and loans to improve the reliability and build out the grid infrastructure, with a particular eye to increasing the capacity of moving clean energy development from wind and solar farms in the west to major cities and areas in the east. Importantly, the bill also extended to FERC the authority to overrule state regulators who deny project permits in DOE-designated transmission corridors, a power that was previously reserved only for gas pipelines. Significant resources provided for battery research, development, and deployment, including new materials, manufacturing, programs to encourage recycling, resources for the development, domestic development of critical and rare earth minerals, and other research and development. Funding for carbon capture and utilization and storage. New $10 billion in new research for hydrogen, energy development, and the establishment of a new $21 billion Office of Clean Energy demonstrations intended to help propel new clean energy innovations forward. But unfortunately, that bill remains pending in the House, as I noted earlier. That is because there is significant concern among House progressives that if they were to go ahead and pass this infrastructure bill, they would lose leverage trying to compel their broader human needs policies ahead in the Senate. There have been efforts to try and secure votes on the infrastructure bill both at the end of September and more recently at the end of October. pledges made by Speaker Pelosi to moderates to try and get this bill moving forward, but yet it remains pending for a vote. At the same time, progressives and others in the House Democratic Caucus and President Biden remain eager to pass their broader American Family Plan agenda and to bring forward many other policies related to climate change. As I noted before, the reconciliation process will be important for moving this forward because it's unlikely to gain any Republican support, which has meant that the bill can only include fiscal measures, nothing that is purely policy. As I noted earlier, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act remains held up because progressives want to withhold their support for it until there's an agreement on the Build Back Better agenda. Through the summer, there was initial discussions about trying to scope out the Build Back Better agenda, including these human needs and climate change policies, and they started at a $6 trillion scope and cost, and then moved downwards to negotiating in the August timeframe a $3.5 trillion base framework for that. Once the framework was passed by the House and the Senate, negotiations on the substance of that bill has continued through the fall. Many of the outstanding issues subject to these negotiations include negotiations on prescription drugs, the expansion of Medicare, paid family leave, immigration issues, controls on methane, and a number of other outstanding issues. So last week, just prior to the president launching off for Europe, negotiations had come to a point where it seemed like that there was an agreement among the various sectors of the Democratic caucus on what would be included in this reconciliation package. Paperwork was sent around sort of celebrating this agreement. It's going to be a $1.75 trillion package, halved again from the initial 3.5, or quartered, I suppose, from $6 trillion to $3.5 trillion, now to $1.75 trillion. But the outline of a 10-year bill with all of its costs fully offset was released last week, creating the impression that votes could be held as soon as last week or as late as this week. Subsequent to that, on Friday of last week, legislative text in the amount of about 1,700 pages was released, including funding for these various programs and specific to energy and climate change, providing a $550 billion climate change and energy title in this bill. Approximately 31% of the entire $1.75 trillion package included extensions of clean energy tax credits and notable modifications that I will get to in a moment, investments and incentives for clean energy technology and manufacturing amounting to about $110 billion, $105 billion provided for resilience, and then $20 billion for clean energy procurement. The bill was forecast to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1 gigaton by 2030. There was hope that this could be voted on prior to the president arriving for the UN climate change panel in Glasgow, but unfortunately that did not occur. And outstanding disputes continue to today. So what is in the legislation that has been released so far? Notably, the bill includes what is effectively a 10-year extension of clean energy tax breaks, and they're coupled into two 5-year tranches of that. The initial tranche is a 5-year extension through the end of 2026 of both the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. The notable modifications I want to cite here are that the new alignment of the tax credit includes a base rate and then a bonus rate. The bonus rate is 5 times the amount of the base rate. For the production tax credit, the base rate would be 0.5 cents per kilowatt hour, and the bonus rate would be 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And under the investment tax credit, the base rate would be 6% of the basis of the energy property, and the bonus rate would equal 30%. So how do you get from the base rate to the bonus rate? The bonus rate for projects is achieved by meeting prevailing wage requirements for the laborers and mechanics employed by contractors and subcontractors on the particular project, and to include apprenticeship requirements. The apprenticeship requirement requires that the percentage of total labor hours of the project are performed by qualified apprentices, and that is an escalating amount from 10% for projects that begin in 2022, increasing to 12.5% for projects beginning in 2023, and 15% for projects beginning thereafter. Provision is applicable to each contractor and subcontractor who employs 4 or more individuals to perform construction work on an applicable project and must include at least 1 qualified apprentice to perform such work. Notably, there are penalties for those who seek to achieve the bonus rate and do not achieve that standard. In those situations, the taxpayer may cure the discrepancy by compensating each worker the difference between wages paid and the prevailing wage, plus interest, in addition to paying a $5,000 penalty to the treasurer for each worker paid below the prevailing wage during the taxable year. And if the Secretary determines that such discrepancy is the product of intentional disregard, the taxpayer must compensate each worker 3 times the difference in wages, and the penalty to the Treasury is increased to $10,000 per employee. And for violations under the apprenticeship requirement, the penalty to the Treasury must be paid equal to $50 multiplied by the total labor hours for which the requirements are not satisfied. In addition to those new requirements on the bonus rate and base rate, under the production tax credit, solar is revived and extended through 2026, and the investment tax credit is modified to include energy storage, linear generators, microgrid controllers, dynamic glass, biogas property, and electric transmission property. There are also additions in the credits for the production tax credit and the investment tax credit if facilities meet domestic content requirements, which specifies that a taxpayer must ensure that any iron, steel, or manufactured product is which part of the project at the time of completion was produced in the United States. There are also increases in the credit if investment is made in energy communities, and that is a definition newly extended for, excuse me one moment here, geographic areas that include current high oil and gas employment levels, areas near coal mines, and areas where there are currently coal-generating employment levels above a certain threshold. And also for investments in solar and wind, there are increases in the credit that may occur in low-income communities. At the same time, there is a reduction in the tax credit of 15% for facilities financed with tax-exempt bonds. There is also newly elective payments, a one-time irrevocable option to treat these tax credits as payments of a tax, permitting entities with little to no tax liability to accelerate their utilization of the credit and obtain that credit paid in cash to them as opposed to an offset of their taxes. Now, before moving on, I know we had a poll question earlier that asked about innovation, asked about incentives, and asked about mandates. So we've touched on innovation, the new $21 billion clean energy demonstration program, and we just talked through significant $320 billion in tax provisions. So where is the mandate? Unfortunately, while the initial plans at the beginning of this year were to move forward with a clean energy standard that would require power generators to generate an increasing amount of their energy through clean energy sources, that was deemed to be a policy provision and not tied to fiscal matters. It was not something that would pass through the reconciliation process. It would get kicked out in what is colloquially known as a bird bath, subject to Senator Byrd, who was the forefather of the reconciliation process. The House then determined that it would try to proceed with what was called a Clean Energy Performance Payment Plan. Under that scenario, utilities and power generators would increase the amount of clean energy they supply to customers by at least 4% over the previous year, in which case they would receive $150 for each megawatt hour above a 1.5% of the previous year's clean energy generation, while those that did not meet the percent target could be charged as much as $40 per megawatt hour. Unfortunately, based on the layout of the Senate, where a 50-50 situation allows any single senator to object and scuttle the process. Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia expressed his opposition to that, feeling that it would undermine the reliability and effectively pay utilities for what they were doing already, and he was not going to support it. So that has been dropped from the portfolio of clean energy measures moving forward, and We are now left with innovation and incentives and far less of anything resembling a mandate. Beyond the extensions of the current clean energy tax credits, there is a transition beginning in 2027 where the ITC and the PTC will shift from a fixed mode specific dollar per kilowatt hour production to a technology neutral credit system based on carbon emission rates. The initial tax credit rates would be the same as the current ITC and PTC, including the base and bonus rate settings, but they will be variable, determined on emission rates to be determined by the Treasury Secretary and given in broad technology categories with safe harbors. Those tax credits would continue to have the domestic content threshold, citing in energy communities or low-income communities as additional benefits. And again, these credits could also be determined to be elective payments as opposed to tax credits. These credits will be phased down as electric power drops below 75% of 2021 levels in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, or by 2031. Other tax credit changes that are included in the Build Back Better Act include an extension of the 45Q carbon oxide sequestration for construction starts that begin before the end of 2031. It extends the production tax credit to zero-emission nuclear power production for the first time, although at a discounted rate. It establishes a new tax credit, 45X, for hydrogen production with variable value rates based on the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And the legislation would revise the Clean Energy Publicly Traded Partnership standards to include income derived from green and renewable energy, generally those eligible for PTC, ITC, as well as renewable fuels and carbon sequestration. Beyond the tax credits, other energy provisions included in this Build Back Better Agenda Act would include $29 billion for a greenhouse gas reduction fund that would provide financing through states and nonprofits for projects that would reduce emissions. Provide $5 billion to states and other local governments for greenhouse gas pollution planning and projects. Provide $1 billion to the Department of Energy and Energy Efficiency Renewable Energy Program for demonstration projects. It also directs the Secretary of Interior to hold offshore wind leases in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, the mid-Atlantic coast states of the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, as well as the territories, Puerto Rico, the American Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and the Northern Marianas Islands. And then it also includes significant expansion of electric vehicle tax credits and grants, resources for expanded charging infrastructure and domestic manufacturing. On that, I will note that they are taking a new approach to the electric vehicle credits. It expanded from $7,500 up to $12,500 maximum electric vehicle tax credit. This includes a base amount of $4,000, $3,500 in addition to that for vehicles that are assembled and sold before 2027. A $4,500 increase if the final assembly of the vehicle is at a facility in the U.S. which operates under a union collective bargaining agreement, and another $500 on the credit if the battery cells are produced in the United States. The ultimate value of those tax credits is capped at 50% of the vehicle purchase price, and there are also income adjustments for filers above $600,000 for a head of household and $800,000 for those filing jointly. There are additional electric vehicle tax credits for commercial vehicles, 30% of the value of the vehicle, and a $1,500 tax credit for electric bicycle purchases. So where do things stand now, and what is it going to take for this bill to get signed into law? In the moments before this webinar started, there were reports that Speaker Pelosi was filing an amendment to the legislative text that was filed on Friday to reflect other changes, including adding back paid family leave that had been dropped from it before, among other changes. It has not been posted yet, so I haven't yet had the opportunity to see it or read it, but there are expectations that that could move to the House floor for a vote as soon as tomorrow or by the weekend. Yet it seems as though that many of these policies remain under negotiation, and Senator Manchin just yesterday was throwing cold water on his level of support for this legislation. The House and Senate are both scheduled to be in recess next week for the Veterans Day holiday, so it's unclear if they don't vote this week when votes may occur, but there continues to be hope that they will get passed by Thanksgiving. The vote that occurred yesterday in Virginia is, of course, bringing about a lot of new quibbling about whether this vote should have taken place sooner or later and whether or not it would have had any effect on the outcome whatsoever. I personally don't think it would have, but it's neither here nor there. So moving forward, we are hopeful that this legislation does make progress and get signed into law. I know many of you are eager to move past the days where tax credits are retroactive or given at 1 or 2 year time, and many of the developers of renewable energy are eager to have long-term certainty of what kind of benefits they can accrue from that. I will look forward to your questions at the end of this webinar, and I'm happy to pass off the mic now to Elena Zermeno, an attorney at Husch Blackwell. Prior to joining the firm's Energy and Natural Resources Group, Elena worked in the Oversight and Enforcement Division and in the Legal Division of the Public Utility Commission of Texas, representing the PUCT before the State Office of Administrative Hearings in various matters, including enforcement, as well as hearings before PUCT administrative law judges. Elena, have at it.
Thank you so much, Eric, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon. As Eric mentioned, my name is Elena Cermeño. I'm an associate at Husch Blackwell, and I work in the Energy and Natural Resources Practice Group. Before we get started on my presentation this afternoon, I just wanted to state that the views and opinions expressed herein are my own and are not representations made by Husch Blackwell. This afternoon, I will be discussing various projects and rulemakings that are being undertaken right now at the Public Utility Commission. These have been largely the result of legislation that was passed during the 87th regular session, which required not only the Public Utility Commission, but also various other state regulatory groups to undertake rulemaking proceedings. It would be helpful for those who are not familiar with the PUC rulemaking process just to have a little bit of background on how those rulemakings typically unfold, which is that generally the PUC staff will author the first draft of a proposed rulemaking and bring it to a public open meeting for the commissioners to consider. If they approve the proposal for publication, or PFP, which is an acronym you'll see throughout my presentation, then it will be publicly posted, and public comment will be allowed to take place over typically a 2 week or so period. After public comment has been received, the commission staff will then draft a new version of the proposed rule, typically taking into account various public comments that have been posted. Sometimes there's a period for reply commentary, sometimes there is not, but ultimately a final version will be brought to a public open meeting. That version is known as a proposal for adoption, or a PFA, which you may also see throughout my presentation. If approved at a public open meeting, then the proposal for adoption will be implemented and the new rule will have a timeline for implementation to take place. So throughout my presentation, I've listed several current projects and rulemakings and future anticipated projects and rulemakings resulting from the 87th legislative session. I won't go through all of these in detail because we'd probably need about 2 more hours of this presentation to do that. But I will talk about some of the key rulemakings. The first I want to note is Project 51830, which is review of certain retail electric customer protection rules. This rulemaking was undertaken due to a bill that was passed in response to the exposure of certain residential customers to volatile market prices during Winter Storm Uri. Several of you may be familiar with a former retail electric provider in the ERCOT marketplace known as Griddy, who offered what are known as indexed products to some of its residential retail electric customers. Those customers were not protected from the very high energy and ancillary service charges that resulted during Winter Storm Uri, and therefore after the storm received astronomically high bills and in an attempt to protect residential and small commercial customers in the future from exposure to those types of volatile market prices, there was legislation passed that prohibited those products from being offered to those customers. So 51830 is the rulemaking where the Commission has implemented that legislation. There was a reply comment period that expired on the proposal for publication back in September, and no hearing was requested on the rule. Therefore, we are waiting for a proposal for adoption to come forward. And so that one is probably going to be resolved shortly. Also notable is 51840, which is a rulemaking to establish weatherization standards, also the result of legislation passed during the legislative session that requires not only generation asset owners within ERCOT, but also transmission service providers to weatherize their equipment, requiring them to be able to effectively operate during extreme weather conditions. The statute requires implementation by December of 2021. The Commission has approved a phased-in approach to this rulemaking because of the quick implementation period. So the rule has actually gone into effect. It was recently approved within the last couple of weeks. The first phase, which has currently gone into effect, will require, and I'll focus primarily in this webinar on generation asset owners, just for purposes of timing, but the first phase will require generation asset owners to implement recommendations that were made previously from a joint FERC-NERC report resulting from a severe winter weather event that happened in 2011. And additionally, will require generation asset owners to identify acute issues that happened during the Winter Storm Uri event and implement whatever changes, upgrades, improvements will be necessary to prevent those acute problems from happening again. There is a good cause exception component to the rulemaking if for some reason a generation asset owner, for example, has identified that a particular upgrade needs to take place, but there's a part that needs to be ordered, for example, and it's not possible to get that part in. There is a process for requesting a good cause exemption. Additionally, there will be a state climatologist report to be authored and finalized by 2022, which will implement phase 2 of the weatherization rulemaking. The Commission has made it clear that ultimately phases 1 and 2 taken together will require generation asset owners to have appropriate weatherization in place to address all types of weatherization issues, both hot and cold related. Additionally, I want to point out Project 51871, which is the review of the ERCOT scarcity pricing mechanism. This was required by Senate Bill 3 passed during the legislative session. It's part of the new PURA subchapter 39.160. This was the result of prices being set at the $9,000 per megawatt hour high system-wide offer cap, or HCAP, for multiple days on end during Winter Storm Uri. This new provision will require the Public Utility Commission to devise an emergency pricing program to take effect after the HCAP has been in place for 12 hours in a 24-hour period. It must allow generators to be reimbursed for reasonable, verifiable operating costs exceeding the cap, and the Commission must review the emergency pricing program at least once every 5 years to determine whether it needs to be updated. So far, there has not been a proposal for publication issued yet on this particular rulemaking proceeding, and I'll note that we are at this point 3 months out from the anniversary of Winter Storm Uri, so it would not be surprising to see a proposal for publication on this particular rule come sometime soon. I will say that back in June, the Public Utility Commission did amend the scarcity pricing rule to amend a tie from the load system-wide offer cap to the fuel index price. So that's one step they have taken to address this issue. And separately, I'll talk shortly about revisions that they're currently considering to the high system-wide offer cap. Additionally, currently underway is Project 52287, Power Outage Alert Criteria. Comments were filed on this rulemaking back in August. And in this particular case, the Commission solicited public comment before issuing a proposal for publication. Sometimes that does happen. And this rulemaking is in response to legislation which requires various regulatory entities throughout the state to devise an alert system when severe winter weather that possibly will impact energy and energy availability is imminent. There's also Project 51841, which is the review of the Commission's substantive rule relating to electric service emergency operations plans. And 51871, review of the ERCOT scarcity pricing mechanism. Do I have two slides in here twice? I'm so sorry. Here we go. 52312, review of administrative penalty authority. This one is notable because Senate Bill 3 actually increased the statutory maximum penalty that can be imposed for violations of weatherization-related mandates. Previously, before this SB 3 was passed, administrative penalties, even for the highest class of violations of Commission substantive rules, was at $25,000 per violation per day. And so the new weatherization rules, once implemented, if violated, could subject those in violation to severely increased maximum penalty amounts. Comments to the proposal for publication were due on September the 16th, and so we are waiting for a proposal for adoption to be presented and brought to a Commission open meeting. There has been a lot of focus from those who have participated in comments and also during Commission-held work sessions on weatherization to put an emphasis on a preparation standard versus a performance standard, because you could only imagine how severe the $1 million per violation per day penalty could be if a performance standard, kind of looking back on what's happened, were imposed versus a preparedness standard to make sure that reasonable measures were put in place to prevent any issues during critical weather events. Also, project number 52345, natural critical gas load. Comments were due in October. This is a joint effort between the Public Utility Commission and the Railroad Commission to designate natural gas facilities that are critical to serving certain types of load during energy emergencies, and to provide that information to transmission and distribution utilities for consideration in load shed processes. That one is currently underway. Also not included in my slides, but as I referenced before, is Project 52631, which is the Commission's review of Substantive Rule 25.505, which is their review of the HCAP, or the High System-Wide Offer Cap. The Commission has proposed possibly decreasing the High System-Wide Offer Cap from $9,000 per megawatt hour to $4,500, which would basically cut it in half. Comments were due back on October the 28th, and we are now waiting for staff to issue a proposal for adoption for the Commission to consider at an open meeting. And then I have a poll question for you all. All right, so this will kind of help inform attention on the rest of my presentation today. So have you, for those of us who are attorneys, recently received questions from clients, or for industry folks who we have tuning in, do you specifically have questions concerned about any impending changes to the ERCOT market? Yes, no, or you're not quite sure. And I'll give everyone a few minutes to answer, or a few seconds. Okay, let's see. Okay, so maybe about half. That's helpful. Thank you very much. And I see that we have some comments on, or some questions coming in about this issue as well. Okay, so review of wholesale electric market design in ERCOT. There has definitely since post-Winter Storm Uri been a focus at the Commission on reviewing the current ERCOT market designs, and with particular emphasis on how we can move away from a scarcity model in an energy-only market to ensure reliability for future winter or any severe weather events. The Commission has hosted several market design-based work sessions. There has been considerable stakeholder comment on this issue. Currently, most recently, there were questions issued by the Commission on certain components of potential market redesign back on October the 26th. And there is actually a work session for those who are interested tomorrow at 9:30 at the Commission. You can tune in online on Admin Market Monitor, where the Commission will be considering commentary that was submitted in response to their October 26th market design questions. Looking forward, the Commission has outlined the schedule that you see up on the screen in terms of when they plan to have a market redesign blueprint finalized, with a goal of December the 20th to issue a final blueprint on market design changes. The Commission has acknowledged that though they anticipate having a blueprint for new changes by the end of the year, implementation is expected to take probably considerably longer, possibly even into 2022 and beyond. So the key topics that we've seen discussed in reviewing and possibly changing the ERCOT market designs is the Commission is putting a considerable emphasis on dispatchable generation and how dispatchable generation enhances reliability. They have asked questions repeatedly about how we can incentivize new investment in responsive generation and how we can additionally incentivize existing dispatchable generation, particularly thermal generation, to stay in ERCOT longer and avoid early retirement. There have been conversations about how renewable generation has the potential to be dispatchable generation when particularly storage is a component on site. The Commission has also explored coming up with new ancillary service products, particularly firming fuel products, and some have advocated for what would be considered a dispatchable reliability service. The Commission has also discussed modifying the ORDC. However, most stakeholder commentary on that issue has made it clear that modifying the ORDC would not be enough on its own to ensure reliability moving forward. Additionally, the Commission has asked ERCOT, who have been key participants in these market design work sessions as well, what they would need to ensure reliability moving forward. And ERCOT has said that they need increased command and control capability, particularly over thermal generation resources. Additionally, there have been several comments submitted to the Commission touting a targeted, more seasonally specific ancillary service product for the market. Common themes that I think we've been hearing about the most in the last several months since Winter Storm Uri are reliability, which the current and new since Winter Storm Uri, PUC Chairman Lake has said is the new lens through which the PUC is considering everything. We've been hearing a lot about dispatchable generation, as I mentioned, about investing in outcomes, and about adopting preparedness. What are we not hearing much about? As I mentioned before, the emergency pricing program that has been mandated by legislation has not necessarily come up in a rulemaking yet. We have not seen much discussion about the PUC seriously considering interconnecting with neighboring grids. We have not heard much consideration of a transition to a capacity market. In fact, we we see the commission generally avoiding that topic or that consideration. And we have not heard much about the benefits of renewable generation absent when it can be considered dispatchable. Although I will say there have been comments more recently that have been made by the commissioners acknowledging that there is significant renewable penetration in ERCOT and that penetration is significant and much appreciated so long as that generation is able to be reached by ERCOT as a resource when most needed. I'll touch very briefly on House Bill 4492 and ERCOT Securitization, which I'm sure a lot of people have been following. As a result of Winter Storm Uri, there was a considerable negative impact on the financial market. And so the legislation was passed attempting to resolve some of those issues. In PUC docket 52321, the Commission recently issued a debt obligation order to address the competitive default balance that resulted as a result of Winter Storm Uri. $800 million was financed to address those competitive defaults. And with the goal of returning funds to wholesale market participants who are owed those amounts, and also refurbishing the CRR auction fund, which ERCOT tapped shortly after Uri to help bring that debt down some. The default balance will be recouped over a period of 30 years via default charges to be collected from all wholesale market participants, including new entrants, and including those who are currently in default but still participating in ERCOT. And then docket 52322 is the docket where the Commission addresses uplift balance financing, which is addressed under PURA subchapter N, which is not more than $2.1 billion to be financed to cover RDPA and ancillary service costs over the system-wide offer cap that were uplifted to load-serving entities on a load ratio share basis during what's defined by statute as the period of emergency, meaning that Winter Storm Uri timeframe. It does not include the prevailing settlement price point. Eligible entities have a one-time opportunity to opt out of uplift charges, and that uplift process is largely being handled in a parallel proceeding, which is docket 52364. This case was resolved via a settlement agreement recently that the Commission adopted. If anyone has specific questions about these financing mechanisms or how the opt-out process works, anything like that, feel free to reach out to me directly. I will mention, for those who are interested in following this, there is a November 29th deadline for eligible entities to file their notice of opt-out election. Those who are eligible to opt out are defined by statute. Largely in my practice, I've been contacted by those eligible entities who are transmission voltage customers. Please be aware that you do have to have paid all of your invoices resulting from the period of emergency to qualify to opt out. And if you are eligible to opt out and are one of those entities defined by statute, you should have received a notice from the load serving entity who served you at the time of Winter Storm Uri. And again, if anyone has questions about those specific issues, feel free to reach out to me directly. Okay, and I did want to reserve a little bit of time for questions. Let me just run through here and see what we have. Oh, I did want to address just really briefly a housekeeping question. We've received some reports that the CEU icon is not working. So just a heads up, apologies for that issue. We will be sending all participants an email tomorrow with a link to report that credit. I'm seeing questions about energy efficiency. There is actually a project open right now addressing energy efficiency. So Lisa, if you have questions about that, or if you would like additional information about how to follow that project, please reach out and I'll give you that information. Victor, I'm seeing if we had a cost recovery mechanism for generators and suppliers, the 2021 February cost would be $3.7 billion and not $16 billion after repricing. I appreciate your comment, and I will say I have seen others express some very similar opinions. Jolly is asking for my views on the disconnect between the gas and power industry on the winterization standards. Out of the 50 gigawatts of generation lost, 25 was gas, and about 40% of that gas generation lost was due to loss of fuel. I will definitely say the Commission is aware that loss of fuel was a huge component of the inability of more traditional generation to come online and provide during Winter Storm Uri. And I would say, this is separate from winterization standards, but I will say that the rulemaking that's being undertaken right now on developing critical natural gas is supposed to address that. There's actually a critical natural gas mapping committee that's been formed and was required to be formed by statute. They are providing updates on their weekly or maybe bi-weekly meetings in a PUC docket, but part of their job is they have been tasked with establishing key critical gas infrastructure that needs to be designated so that in the future, if there's another similar Winter Storm Uri event or another energy crisis of a similar magnitude, that it has been determined which natural gas facilities are critical to ensuring that gas gets to generation resources so that we don't have inadvertent load shed of generation to or of gas to combined cycle generators, things of that nature. Jolly, I also see a comment about the natural gas industry only wants to label the gas facilities as critical if they are tied to the generator. And then it looks like part of your question is cut off. I will say that there is, on the Railroad Commission's end of the critical load natural gas rulemaking, they have included an exception or some type of opt-out provision. I'm not as familiar with that process that's undergoing, but I will say that there was a Senate Business and Commerce Committee hearing recently, within the last 3 weeks or so, I think, where both the chairman of the PUC and the executive director of the Railroad Commission presented to the Business Senate and Commerce Committee on the steps that they have taken to implement the 87th regular session legislation. And when the Railroad Commission executive director was presenting on this natural gas, critical natural gas facilities rulemaking, he was met with significant pushback by the committee for that opt-out. And as a result, the Railroad Commission opened up public comment further on that rulemaking. And so I'm sure there have been some additional comments filed in that rulemaking, and it would not surprise me if they are firming up that opt-out as a result of that feedback from the legislators. I'm seeing if gas wellheads have power with gas wellhead out 110 degrees, then pipes for the most part don't freeze, which we saw in real time during the February storm. Thank you for your comment, Victor. That's very interesting. I do not have the engineering expertise to comment on that, but that's, I will take you at your word. That's very interesting. Any comments on ERCOT actions regarding distributed energy resources, including battery storage? James, absolutely. And thank you for pointing that out because I missed that important comment in my presentation. There has definitely been commentary and emphasis on the importance of bringing demand response and distributed generation into the loop more in terms of the ERCOT model redesign. And the commissioners have mentioned many times that battery storage is here in ERCOT and even more is in the queue. Even more will be coming online, and that is a valuable resource, and that batteries are key to ensuring that that renewable and intermittent resources are even more dispatchable. So I wouldn't say that there have been any specific actions I'm aware of to bring more batteries online as a result of the market redesigns, and largely that's because the market redesign conversations are continuing to happen, and the new ERCOT blueprint has not yet been issued by the commission. But I will say that it does seem there will be more of a focus moving forward than there has been in the past on integrating distributed generation and demand response and storage into the market structure. Okay. And I'm seeing a few more similar comments. A question about whether we'll continue to see price distortion in the market. It's hard to opine on the likelihood of that until the new ERCOT blueprint is issued. We certainly hope not. The market redesign has had so much stakeholder input, and I think you use a term like price distortion. That's certainly something that the Public Utility Commission is going to ensure does not happen. And just so we keep in mind, there is the Independent Market Monitor, which is or the IMM, which monitors possible market manipulation and price distortion in the ERCOT market. And so I'm sure they will be keeping a staunch eye out for any potential issues like that might result from the market redesign. All right. And with that, I think I would just say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope the information was helpful to you and to your organization. As a reminder, we do apologize that the CEU icon was not working today, so we will be sending everyone an email with the link for reporting your credit. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed additionally. Please be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. If anyone has any lingering questions about mine or Eric's presentations, please feel free to reach out to us individually offline. And this will conclude our webinar. Thank you very much for participating today.